Imagine the most sophisticated fighting force in the world suddenly grinding to a halt, not because of a decisive tank battle, but because they ran out of gas, their engines froze, and their supply chain just collapsed. In June 1941, the German Wehrmacht was an unstoppable juggernaut. They had perfected the art of Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Yet within 6 months they were staring defeat in the face at the gates of Moscow. This failure wasn't due to a lack of tactical skill. It was a failure of arithmetic and asphalt. We often credit General Winter or Hitler's strategic mistakes, but many military historians argue that the war was ultimately decided by a single critical factor: the Soviet Union's hidden logistical strength that overwhelmed the German army's inherent fragility. So was the most technologically advanced army of the era defeated by its own supply chain long before it ever met the enemy's main forces. The German strategic plan for Operation Barbarossa was fundamentally flawed from the very beginning. It was based on an assumption of speed that its logistics could never support. Now, the Blitzkrieg strategy worked beautifully in France because the distances were short and the existing infrastructure was excellent. But the plan for the Soviet Union was on a completely different scale. It demanded the army advance 500 kilometers in just the first month. Here's the fatal flaw. German logistics planners had already calculated that the supply line would break down once the army advanced 300 miles, or about 500 kilometers, past the border. Moscow was 600 miles away. The entire invasion relied on the desperate hope that the Soviet regime would collapse politically before the trucks ran empty. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the very man who would later surrender at Stalingrad, drafted this plan. It was built on the terrifying assumption that the Soviet Union had to be defeated in 8 to 10 weeks. They prioritized speed over sustenance, a gamble of historic proportions. Could the German High Command have launched the invasion knowing the math didn't work, or was the ideological drive to attack just too strong to resist? The Soviet response was a masterpiece of strategic denial that instantly turned the German advance into a logistical nightmare. The single greatest hurdle was the railway gauge difference. You see, European rails were a standard gauge of 1435 millimeters, but Russian rails were significantly wider at 1524 millimeters. This meant German trains couldn't simply drive into the Soviet interior. It was a physical barrier. On top of that, the retreating Soviets meticulously implemented a scorched earth policy. They destroyed or evacuated all their rolling stock and locomotives. This forced the Germans to rely almost entirely on their limited, fragile truck transport until the tracks could be physically converted. A monumental task requiring hundreds of thousands of hours of manual labor. As historian David Stahel notes, the Wehrmacht captured almost nothing usable in those crucial early weeks. The Soviets had successfully shifted the conflict from a race against time to a war against infrastructure itself. Just imagine, how much faster would the German advance have been if their trains had been able to run freely, without interruption, from Berlin all the way to Smolensk? Then came the decisive episode, when the environment combined with the logistical deficiency to stop the Wehrmacht dead in its tracks. By October 1941, the autumn rains brought the infamous Rasputitsa, the time without roads. The unpaved dirt tracks of Russia turned into impassable waist-deep seas of mud. It was a complete logistical collapse. German engines designed for paved European roads failed rapidly as abrasive dust and mud literally destroyed their transmissions. Supply wagons that should have been pulled by 1 or 2 horses now required 8, sometimes 10, just to drag a single truck out of the mire. The famed Panzer commander, Field Marshal Heinz Guderian, wrote that his tanks were moving at a walking pace, and fuel consumption had tripled. Even during the summer, the situation was dire. General Quartermaster Eduard Wagner reported, "We are operating with a transport margin of 0. This meant any failure at the rear translated instantly into starvation or lack of ammunition at the front. If you were a German commander, what would you rather face? A massive Soviet counterattack, or the soul-crushing sight of your entire supply train sinking into the mud? And here's where we find one of the biggest secrets of the campaign. The Wehrmacht often hailed as the world's first fully mechanized army, made a secret strategic commitment to an outdated mode of transport that crippled its logistics. I'm talking about the horse. The German army relied on over 650,000 horses to pull artillery and supply wagons. Now a truck needs fuel only when it moves, but a horse requires 10 to 20 pounds of fodder every single day, whether it's moving or not. By the time deep winter set in, the German logistics system was forced to use its scarce rail capacity to transport hay to the front lines, just to feed the horses. That was rail space that should have been used for vital ammunition and food for the men. To make matters worse, winter gear, which actually existed in warehouses in Poland, was not shipped. Quartermaster Wagner made the fatal calculation to prioritize fuel and ammunition on the few functioning railways, gambling that the war would be over before the deep freeze. It was a gamble he lost. The physics of winter then turned against them, as German lubricants and even the recoil fluids in their artillery froze solid, rendering their equipment useless. Does the logistical need for hay over bullets perfectly encapsulate the strategic failure of Operation Barbarossa? But the true Soviet logistical victory was something else entirely. It was the staggering successful relocation of their entire industrial base, ensuring production never stopped. Between 1941 and 1942, the Soviets managed to completely dismantle, transport via rail, and reassemble over 1,500 major industrial facilities, including entire tank factories, moving them east of the Ural Mountains, far out of reach of the German Air Force. This incredible feat ensured that while the Wehrmacht starved, the Soviets were able to maintain and even increase their production of reliable winterized equipment, like the legendary T-34 tank. Suddenly, German quality was being overwhelmed by Soviet volume. The battle shifted from one decided by tactical skill to one decided by sheer industrial capacity. Historian Richard Overy emphasizes that this industrial depth was a crucial factor that the German planners had fundamentally miscalculated. This begs the question: was the most decisive battle of the Eastern Front fought by the factory workers on the assembly lines in the Urals, and not by the soldiers at Stalingrad? This catastrophic logistical failure also forced the Wehrmacht into morally bankrupt strategies that, ironically, fueled their own defeat. Because their official supply system had completely failed, the German High Command was forced to adopt the Hunger Plan directive. This meant effectively living off the land. It was a systematic policy of confiscating all food and livestock from the Soviet population. This brutal looting created a massive, enraged partisan movement right behind the German lines. These partisans then focused their efforts on sabotage, specifically blowing up the critical railway lines and roads the Germans desperately needed for supplies. It became a vicious cycle. Lack of logistics led to looting, which created resistance, and that resistance destroyed what little logistics were left. Letters from German soldiers often describe the heartbreaking reality of this policy. One wrote, "We take their cows. The women cry, but what can we do? It is us or them." Where is the moral breaking point for an army when starvation forces soldiers to choose between following orders and their own basic humanity? So let's consider a what-if scenario. If we were to grant the Germans a logistical miracle, could the outcome have been different? Military analysts argue that if Germany had standardized its vehicles, immediately fixed the railway gauge issue, and focused on a small number of reliable winterized tank models like the Panther, instead of over-engineered unreliable machines like the Tiger, they would have been far more resilient. But even then, logistics experts suggest that the sheer distances of the Soviet Union still presented an almost insurmountable problem. Even with perfect logistics, Germany simply did not have the oil reserves for a long war of attrition. The consensus among modern analysts is that this initial logistical fragility might have delayed an inevitable Soviet victory, but it could not have averted it, given the overwhelming industrial and manpower disparity. But what do you think? If Germany had prioritized reliability over technical perfection, could they have stalled the war long enough to force a negotiated peace? In the end, the failure of the German Blitzkrieg in the East was not a failure of courage or firepower. It was a failure of the Quartermaster. The Wehrmacht drove toward a horizon they could never reach, ignoring the simple, unforgiving math of distance, fuel, and supplies. The Soviets won by combining strategic denial with their scorched earth policy, environmental resilience against the Rasputitsa, and an industrial capacity that literally outproduced the enemy's quality. Which of these factors, the Russian mud, the frozen oil, or the Soviet factories, do you believe was the single most decisive opponent for the German army? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Verified WWII Stories for more deep dives into the turning points of history. Thanks for watching.